If we lay on the table religion, communism, Nazism, they are all unifying ethos. They're unifying ideas, but they're also horribly dividing ideas. They both unify and divide. Religion has also divided people.
Yeah.
Because in the nuances of how the different peoples wrestle with God, they have come to different conclusions, and then they use those conclusions, or perhaps the people in power use those conclusions to then start wars, to start hatred, to divide.
Yeah, well, it's one of the key sub-themes in the Gospels is the sub-theme of the Pharisees. And so the fundamental enemies of Christ in the Gospels are the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers. So what does that mean? The Pharisees are religious hypocrites. The scribes are academics who worship their own intellect. And the lawyers are the legal minds who use the law as a weapon. And so they're the enemy of the Redeemer. That's a subplot in the gospel stories. And that actually all means something. The Pharisaic problem is that the best of all possible ideas can be used by the worst actors in the worst possible way. And maybe this is an existential conundrum, is that the most evil people use the best possible ideas to the worst possible ends. And then you have the conundrum of how do you separate out, let's say, the genuine religious people from those who use the religious enterprise only for their own machinations. We're seeing this happen online. Like, one of the things that you're seeing happening online, I'm sure you've noticed this, especially on the right-wing psychopathic troll side of the distribution, is the weaponization of a certain form of Christian ideation. And that's often marked, at least online, by the presence of, what would you say, cliches like Christ is king, which has a certain religious meaning, but a completely different meaning in this sphere of emerging right-wing pathology. Right-wing. The political dimension isn't the right dimension of analysis, but it's definitely the case that the best possible ideas can be used for the worst possible purposes. And that also brings up another specter, which is like, well, is there any reliable and valid way of distinguishing truly beneficial unifying ideas from those that are pathological? And so that's another thing that I tried to detail out in these lectures, but also in this new book. It's like, how do you tell the good actors from the bad actors at the most fundamental level of analysis?
And good ideas from the bad ideas, and you lecture on truth that Nietzsche also struggled with. So how do you know that communism is a bad idea versus it's a good idea implemented by bad actors?
Right. That's a more subtle variant of the religious problem, and that's what the communists say all the time. The modern day communists are like, real communism has never been tried. And you could say, I suppose, with some justification, you could say that real Christianity has never been tried because we always fall short of the ideal mark. And so, I mean, my rejoinder to the communists is something like, every single time it's been implemented, wherever it's been implemented, regardless of the culture and the background of the people who've implemented it, it's had exactly the same catastrophic consequences. It's like, I don't know how many examples you need of that, but I believe we've generated sufficient examples so that that case is basically resolved. Now, the general rejoinder to that is, it's really something like, well, if I was in charge of the communist enterprise, the utopia would have come about. Right. But that's also a form of dangerous pretense. Part of the way, see, that problem is actually resolved to some degree in the developing notion of sacrifice that emerges in the Western canon over thousands and thousands of years. So one of the suggestions, for example, and this is something exemplified in the Passion story, is that you can tell the valid holder of an idea because that holder will take the responsibility for the consequences of his idea onto himself. And that's why, for example, you see one way of conceptualizing Christ in the gospel story is as the ultimate sacrifice to God. So you might ask, well, what's the ultimate sacrifice? And there are variants of an answer to that. One form of ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of a child, the offering of a child, and the other is the offering of the self. And the story of Christ brings both of those together because he's the Son of God that's offered to God. And so it's an archetypal resolution of that tension between ultimate sacrifice. Ultimate because once you're a parent, most parents would rather sacrifice themselves than their children, right? So you have something that becomes of even more value than yourself. But the sacrifice of self is also a very high order level of sacrifice. Christ is an archetype of the pattern of being that's predicated on the decision to offer everything up to the highest value, right? That pattern of self-sacrifice. And I think part of the reason that's valid is because the person who undertakes to do that pays the price themselves. It's not externalized. They're not trying to change anyone else, except maybe by example. It's your problem. And that, like Solzhenitsyn pointed that out too, when he was struggling with the idea of good versus evil. And you see this in more sophisticated literature. You know, in really unsophisticated literature or drama, there's a good guy and the bad guy. And the good guy's all good. And the bad guy's all bad. And in more sophisticated literature, the good and bad are abstracted. You can think of them as spirits. And then those spirits possess all the characters in the complex drama to a greater or lesser degree. And that battle is fought out both socially and internally. In the high order religious conceptualizations in the West, if they culminate, let's say, in the Christian story, the notion is that battle between good and evil is fundamentally played out as an internal drama.
Yeah, so for a religious ethos, the battle between good and evil is fought within each individual human heart.
Right. It's your moral duty to constrain evil within yourself. And well, there's more to it than that, because there's also the insistence that if you do that, that makes you the most effective possible, like, warrior, let's say, against evil itself in the social world. That you start with the battle that occurs within you, in the soul, let's say. The soul becomes the battleground between the forces of good and evil. The idea that there's an idea there too, which is if that battle is undertaken successfully, then it doesn't have to be played out in the social world as actual conflict, right? You can rectify the conflict internally without it having to be played out as fate, as Jung put it.
So what would you say to Nietzsche, who called Christianity the slave morality? And his critique of religion in that way was slave morality versus master morality. And then you put in Ubermensch into that.
See, I would say that the woke phenomenon is the manifestation of the slave morality that Nietzsche criticized, and that there are elements of Christianity that can be gerrymandered to support that mode of perception and conception. But I think he was wrong in his essential criticism of Christianity in that regard. Now, it's complicated with Nietzsche because Nietzsche never criticizes the gospel stories directly. What he basically criticizes is something like the pathologies of institutionalized religion. And I would say most particularly of the, of the sort of casually too nice Protestant form. You know, that's a thumbnail sketch and perhaps somewhat unfair, but given the alignment, let's say, of the more mainstream Protestant movements with the woke mob, I don't think it's an absurd criticism. And it's something like the degeneration of Christianity into the notion that good and harmless are the same thing, or good and empathic are the same thing, which is simply not true and far too simplified. And I also think Nietzsche was extremely wrong in his presumption that human beings should take it to themselves to construct their own values. I think he made a colossal error in that presumption.
And that is the idea of the Ubermensch, that the great individual, the best of us, should create our own values.
Well, and I think the reason that he was wrong about that is that, so when God gives instructions to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he basically tells them that they can do anything they want in the walled garden. So that's the kind of balance between order and nature that makes up the human environment. Human beings have the freedom vouchsafed to them by God to do anything they want in the garden except to mess with the most fundamental rule. So God says to people, you're not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which fundamentally means there is an implicit moral order and you're to abide by it. Your freedom stops at the foundation. And you can think about that. I'd be interested even in your ideas about this as an engineer, let's say, is that there is an ethos that's implicit in being itself. And your ethos has to be a reflection of that. And that isn't under your control. You can't gerrymander the foundation because your foundational beliefs have to put you in harmony, like musical harmony, with the actual structure of reality as such. So I can give you an example of that. So our goal, insofar as we're conducting ourselves properly, is to have the kind of interesting conversation that allows both of us to express ourselves in a manner that enables us to learn and grow, such that we can share that with everyone who's listening. And if our aim is true and upward, then that's what we're doing. Well, that means that we're going to have to match ourselves to a pattern of interaction, and that's marked for us emotionally. Like you and I both know this. If we're doing this right, we're going to be interested in the conversation. We're not going to be looking at our watch. We're not going to be thinking about what we're aiming at. We're just going to communicate. Now, the religious interpretation of that would be that we were doing something like making the redemptive logos manifest between us in dialogue. And that's something that can be shared. To do that, we have to align with that pattern. I can't decide that there's some arbitrary way that I'm going to play you. I mean, I could do that if I was a psychopathic manipulator, but to do that optimally, I'm not going to impose a certain mode of a certain a priori aim, let's say, on our communication and manipulate you into that. So the constraints on my ethos reflect the actual structure of the world. And I can't, this is the communist presumption. It's like, we're going to burn everything down and we're going to start from scratch. And we've got these axiomatic presumptions and we're going to put them into place and we're going to socialize people so they now think and live like communists from day one. And human beings are infinitely malleable. And we can use a rational set of presuppositions to decide what sort of beings they should be. The transhumanists are doing this too. It's like, no, there's a pattern of being that you have to fall into alignment with. And I think it's the pattern of being, by the way, that if you fall into alignment with, it gives you hope. It protects you from anxiety, and it gives you a sense of harmony with your surroundings and with other people. And none of that's arbitrary.
But don't you think we both arrived to this conversation with rigid axioms that we have? Maybe we're blind to them, but in the same way that the Marxists came with very rigid axioms about the way the world is and the way it should be, aren't we coming to that?
Well, we definitely come to the conversation with a hierarchy of foundational axioms, right? And I would say the more sophisticated you are as a thinker, the deeper the level at which you're willing to play. So imagine first that you have presumptions of different depth. There's more predicated on the more fundamental axioms. And then that there's a space of play around those. And that space of play is going to depend on the sophistication of the player, obviously. But those who are capable of engaging in deeper conversations talk about more fundamental things with more play. Now, we have to come to the conversation with a certain degree of structure because we wouldn't be able to understand each other or communicate if a lot of things weren't already assumed or taken for granted.
How rigid is the hierarchy of axioms that religion provides? This is what I'm trying to understand. The rigidity of that hierarchy.
It's as rigid as play.
Well, play is not rigid at all.
No. It's got a rigidity.
There's some constraints.
It took me about 40 years to figure out the answer to that question. So it wasn't, I'm serious about that. So it wasn't a random answer. So play is very rigid in some ways. So like if you and I go out to play basketball or chess, like there are rules and you can't break the rules because then you're no longer in the game. But then there's a dynamism within those rules that's, well, with chess, it's virtually infinite. I mean, I think, what is it? There's more patterns of potential games on a chessboard than there are subatomic particles in the observable universe. Like it's an insane space. So it's not like there's not freedom within it. But it's a weird paradox in a way, isn't it? Because music is like this too, is that there are definitely rules. And there are things, you can't throw a basketball into a chess board and still be playing chess. But weirdly enough, if you adhere to the rules, the realm of freedom increases rather than decreasing. And I think you can make the same case for a playful conversation. It's like we're playing by certain rules, and a lot of them are implicit, but that doesn't mean that. It might mean the reverse of constraint, because in this seminar, for example, that I was referring to, the Exodus seminar and then the Gospel seminar, everybody in the seminar, there's about 8 of us, played fair. Nobody used power. Nobody tried to prove they were right. They put forward their points, but they were like, here's a way of looking at that. Assess it. And they were also doing it genuinely. It's like, this is what I've concluded about, say, this story. And I'm going to make a case for it, but I'd like to hear what you have to say, because maybe you can change it, you can extend it, you can find a flaw in it. And that's a conversation that has flow and that's engaging and that other people will listen to as well. And that's also, I think that one of the things that we can conclude now, and we can do this even from a neuroscientific basis, is that sense of engaged meaning is a marker not only for the emergence of harmony between you and your environment, but for the emergence of that harmony in a way that is developmentally rich, that moves you upward towards, what would you say? I think towards a more effective entropic state. That's actually the technical answer to that. But it makes you more than you are. And there's a directionality in that.